Sophie Hart had always lived a life carefully wrapped in routines, a cocoon of comfort that kept her heart safe from the unpredictable chaos of emotions. She loved her quiet job at the local bookstore, the smell of old pages, the small conversations with regular customers, and her weekend hikes where the trees whispered secrets she felt she could almost understand. Yet she had always avoided love, not because she didn't long for it, but because the thought of opening herself completely to someone terrified her more than anything else. She had watched friends fall in love, fall apart, and she had silently vowed never to risk that kind of pain herself. Yet on a rainy Thursday, as the world outside the store was washed in gray, a young man with soft brown hair, a hesitant smile, and eyes that seemed to hold both warmth and an untold sadness walked through the door. He lingered in the poetry section, pretending to browse, but Sophie noticed the subtle tension in his movements, the way he traced his fingers along the spines of books as if looking for something he couldn't name, and she felt an unfamiliar pull in her chest, a tug she had spent years carefully ignoring, compelling her to speak, to connect. Even though every fiber of her being screamed to retreat, she found herself approaching him, introducing herself, and in that simple act of courage, feeling her heartbeat quicken, her palms sweat, a mixture of fear and excitement that was entirely new. And when he spoke, his voice low but gentle, sharing a story about a city he had visited, a photograph he had taken, Sophie felt a strange resonance, a recognition of someone who had seen both beauty and pain in the world, and without realizing it, she was laughing at his jokes, smiling in a way she hadn't in years, her walls cracking ever so slightly, allowing light to slip in. The conversation stumbled at times, words hesitant, glances lingering, yet there was a connection forming, fragile but undeniable. And when he finally asked if she would like to join him for coffee sometime, Sophie froze, her mind racing with doubts, with memories of every heartbreak she had carefully avoided, with the safety of her predictable life pressing against the allure of this unknown. But something in his gaze, steady and sincere, seemed to ask her to trust, to step forward despite her fear. And after a pause that felt like an eternity, she nodded, a small word that carried enormous weight, agreeing to something that terrified her more than she could admit. And as she walked home that evening through puddled streets reflecting the fading light, her mind whirled with questions she didn't have answers to. What if it was a mistake? What if it hurt? But beneath the anxiety was a spark, fragile but persistent, a hint that perhaps life beyond fear could be brighter, richer, and more real than she had allowed herself to imagine. And that night, lying in her quiet apartment with the rain tapping softly against the windows, Sophie felt a mixture of dread and exhilaration. The realization that she had taken a step she had never taken before, that she had invited uncertainty into her life, and yet, in that very act, in the simple decision to say yes, she discovered something profoundly new, an awakening, a recognition that sometimes the scariest choices, the ones that make our hearts pound and our minds scream in protest, are exactly the ones that have the power to change everything, to open doors we didn't even know existed. And as sleep eventually claimed her, Sophie's last thought was not of fear, but of the strange, thrilling possibility that maybe, just maybe, this encounter, this unexpected connection, could be the beginning of a story she had been too afraid to live. Until now, the week after Sophie had agreed to meet Ethan for coffee, her mind refused to settle. Every thought was a whirl of excitement and fear, a restless storm that left her both thrilled and anxious. And when they finally met at the small cafe by the river, she was surprised at how natural it felt to be near him. How easy it was to laugh at his stories about distant cities, sunrises he had chased, and people he had met along the way, each tale colored with warmth and subtle melancholy that made Sophie feel seen in ways she hadn't expected. And as they sipped their coffee, she found herself opening up about things she usually kept to herself, tiny confessions about childhood dreams, her love for quiet moments, her fear of stepping into the unknown. And Ethan listened with a patience and understanding that made her heart both ache and swell, as if it had been dormant for years and was now awakening. And every glance they exchanged carried a weight of unspoken emotions, an invisible tether drawing them closer even as she felt the tension of vulnerability, the ever-present fear that she might be judged or rejected, that history might repeat itself. Yet there was something in Ethan's calm presence that whispered it was safe to try, to lean in, to take a risk she had never allowed herself. And when he invited her to join him on a weekend photography trip to a scenic area outside the city, Sophie froze, panic rising immediately because leaving the comfort of her home, venturing into new spaces with someone she barely knew, spending nights away from her familiar world, was precisely the kind of leap she had always avoided. Yet as she considered declining, she felt an unexpected pull, a curiosity that whispered maybe growth and joy lived just on the other side of fear. And after hours of thinking, she realized she couldn't say no, that saying yes, despite the pounding of her heart and the tremble in her hands, was a chance to break free from the cage she had built around her emotions, a chance to see herself, not as someone cautious and afraid, but as someone capable of courage. And as she packed, she felt a strange combination of dread and anticipation, imagining long drives, unknown roads, the vulnerability of sharing close quarters with someone whose presence already stirred her in ways she couldn't name. And yet beneath the fear was a flicker of excitement, the possibility of discovering something she had denied herself for years. And when the weekend arrived, the world seemed to hum with expectation, each mile bringing new scenery and moments where Sophie felt simultaneously exhilarated and terrified. And Ethan's presence was comforting yet stirring, his laughter, his quiet observations, the way he seemed attuned to the world around them, all of it nudging Sophie out of her rigid self-protection, making her see beauty in spontaneity, connection in small gestures, and meaning in shared silences. And as they explored fields bathed in golden sunlight, forests that smelled of earth and life, and quiet lakes reflecting endless skies, Sophie realized that this weekend was already reshaping her, teaching her that fear was not a wall but a signal, a challenge to rise above. And with every passing moment, the tight grip of her old life loosened, replaced by curiosity, wonder, and an emotional openness she hadn't dared to feel before. And when night fell and they sat by a small campfire under a sky crowded with stars, Ethan shared stories of heartbreak, lost love, and lessons learned in foreign lands, and Sophie felt compelled to speak her own truths, trembling as she voiced her fears, her loneliness, the longing she had buried. And when she did, a weight lifted she hadn't realized she carried, her vulnerability met with gentle understanding, not judgment. And as Ethan reached out to touch her hand lightly, she felt a spark, a warmth that made her chest ache with hope and fear intertwined. And she understood that the most terrifying part was not leaving her comfort zone, nor the unknown roads ahead, but allowing someone to truly see her heart, her hidden corners, the fragile edges she usually kept hidden. Yet in that moment, surrounded by the quiet night and the flickering flames, she felt alive in a way she never had. Her pulse quick with courage and desire, realizing that sometimes stepping into the things we fear most, whether it is a weekend trip, a conversation, or a chance to be seen, can awaken parts of ourselves that lie dormant, that the unknown carries not just risk, but the potential for joy, intimacy, and profound connection. And by the end of the first night, as she lay in the small cabin, listening to the wind whisper through the trees and the distant hum of the world around her, Sophie understood that she had already begun a transformation, a journey where fear was no longer a stopping point, but a guide. And that whatever came next, the courage to say yes, to move forward despite her trepidation, had opened a door to experiences she could never have imagined from the safety of her routine. And she drifted to sleep with a heart both full and unsteady, knowing the weekend held more revelations, more moments that would challenge her, yet also teach her that the most feared things, when embraced, could become the most unforgettable, most beautiful experiences of her life. The weekend with Ethan had begun to change Sophie in ways she hadn't anticipated, every step outside her comfort zone pushing her heart to open just a little more. And as they drove through winding country roads, golden fields stretching on either side and the scent of wildflowers drifting in the air, Sophie felt a nervous excitement she hadn't experienced in years, a mix of anticipation and fear that made her pulse quicken. And when they reached the small, secluded cabin by the lake, a place Ethan had discovered on one of his previous trips, she was struck by its quiet beauty, the stillness of the water reflecting the sky like glass, the trees surrounding them as if shielding their little world from the rest of existence. And in that moment, she realized that she had entered a space both literal and emotional, a world outside her predictable life where every moment demanded openness, courage, and trust. And as they unpacked their bags, their hands brushing occasionally, Sophie felt a shiver of awareness, an intimacy growing silently, a tension neither of them needed words to acknowledge. And when they set out on their first hike to a nearby overlook, the path winding through tall grass and over gentle hills, Ethan's presence beside her was both comforting and stirring, his quiet confidence making her feel safe even as the thrill of unfamiliarity kept her senses alert. and with each step, each shared glance, Sophie felt her walls crack, her fears soften, the protective shell she had built around her emotions slowly eroding under the gentle insistence of connection. And when they finally reached the top of the hill, breathless from the climb and greeted by a sunset that painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, she turned to Ethan, and the look in his eyes, a mixture of admiration and something deeper, made her heart leap and her chest ache in ways she couldn't fully name. And in that moment, surrounded by breathtaking beauty and the quiet rustle of nature, Sophie realized that she was beginning to feel, really feel, for the first time in years, that love wasn't a danger to hide from but a possibility to embrace, even if it terrified her. And that night, as they returned to the cabin, the sky now dotted with countless stars, they shared a quiet dinner, the soft clinking of utensils and the warmth of a small fire creating a cocoon of intimacy. And Ethan began to tell her stories of heartbreak, loss, and lessons learned during his travels, each word spoken with honesty that made Sophie's own vulnerabilities rise to the surface, a tide of emotions she had long kept hidden. And finally, unable to resist the need to be real, to be seen, she spoke of her own fears, the years of caution, the longing for connection she had buried beneath routine and safety. And as she spoke, her voice trembling but determined, Ethan listened, his gaze steady, empathetic, and without judgment, his presence offering a rare kind of comfort that made Sophie feel seen, understood, and accepted. And when he gently reached for her hand, a simple touch that carried warmth and reassurance, her heart responded with an intensity she hadn't expected, a mix of hope, longing, and the thrill of vulnerability. And as the fire crackled and the night wrapped around them, Sophie realized that the most terrifying thing had never been leaving her comfort zone, nor the uncertainty of a new relationship, but allowing someone to witness her heart, to understand her fears and dreams. And yet, in that very act of courage, she discovered exhilaration, a sense of liberation, a joy that had been missing from her carefully structured life. And in the quiet hours, as they sat together watching the stars, talking softly about everything and nothing, Sophie felt a shift within herself, a recognition that stepping into fear could awaken parts of her she had long ignored, that real connection required risk, that love demanded bravery, and that sometimes the very things that scared her most could become the most beautiful experiences she would ever have. And as the night deepened and the world outside fell silent, she realized that her heart, once cautious and closed, was now awake, her emotions vibrant and alive, her longing acknowledged and met. And she knew that the journey was far from over, that the days ahead would challenge her further, push her boundaries. And yet she felt ready, not because fear had disappeared, but because she had tasted the freedom and joy that came from embracing it. And that moment, under the vast, starlit sky, with the gentle sound of the lake lapping against the shore and Ethan's presence beside her, Sophie understood that she was no longer the same woman who had hesitated at the thought of coffee or a weekend trip, that she was becoming someone who could step boldly into the unknown, trust her heart, and experience life with a depth of feeling she had never allowed herself to know. And the quiet smile she shared with Ethan, full of both gratitude and newfound courage, marked the beginning of a transformation, one where fear was no longer a prison but a doorway, where vulnerability was not weakness but a gateway to intimacy, where love, though unpredictable, could be pursued with hope. And as they finally retired for the night, hearts beating with the quiet rhythm of anticipation and fulfillment, Sophie understood that sometimes the things we fear most, leaving routines, opening our hearts, risking emotional exposure, can become the moments that teach us the most about who we are, the experiences that shape our lives in ways we never imagined. And that in facing the fear of emotional closeness, she had found a profound joy, a connection that stirred her soul, and a lesson that would stay with her forever. The most rewarding experiences are often hidden behind the doors we are most afraid to open. By the time the last morning of their weekend trip arrived, Sophie felt a transformation within herself that she hadn't anticipated, a quiet strength and warmth that had grown from every conversation, every shared glance, every moment she had dared to step beyond her comfort zone. And as the first light of dawn stretched across the lake, reflecting soft pinks and golds on the still water, she realized that fear, which had once ruled her life, had been replaced by a thrilling awareness that vulnerability could bring beauty, connection, and unexpected joy. And as she and Ethan packed their belongings, their movements casual yet filled with an unspoken tenderness, she noticed the ease in their companionship, the small jokes, the lingering touches, the way their eyes met with a familiarity that had formed in just a few days, yet felt timeless, and the drive back to the city was filled with a quiet energy, a mixture of reflection and anticipation, each mile a reminder of the courage she had summoned to say yes, to leave her routines, to embrace the unknown, and she caught herself smiling at memories of their hikes, the fiery sunsets, the way Ethan had told stories of heartbreak and hope, and how she had finally shared her own truths, the tremor in her voice when she admitted fears she had long hidden, the laughter and gentle teasing, the warmth of holding hands by the campfire, all of it weaving a tapestry of emotions that felt as if it had always been waiting for her to experience. And as they stopped at a small overlook before entering the city, Ethan turned to her, his expression soft and honest, and said, "You did something brave this weekend," and Sophie felt a swell of pride and a rush of emotion, realizing that the bravery he spoke of wasn't just about joining him on a trip, but about opening her heart, letting someone in, trusting not only him but herself, and she thought about how easy it would have been to say no, to retreat to safety, and how that choice would have kept her world small, predictable, and quiet, and she understood now that the decision to face fear had created an experience far richer than any she had imagined, a series of moments that had taught her to feel deeply, to embrace uncertainty, to recognize the beauty in emotional risk, and the intimacy that comes when two people meet with honesty and courage. And as they continued driving, the conversation flowed effortlessly, a mix of reflection on the weekend, dreams for the future, and quiet observations about the world passing outside the windows, the sun climbing higher, the air warm and fresh, carrying the sense of late morning and life waking around them, and Sophie noticed how naturally she laughed, how freely she spoke, how her heart no longer thumped with dread at the idea of closeness. And the more she let herself feel, the more alive she became, aware that the lessons of this weekend were about more than Ethan, more than the trip, they were about her own capacity for courage, for love, for connection, for daring to risk emotional exposure and finding it rewarding rather than dangerous. And as they approached the city, she felt a bittersweet tug in her chest, knowing the cocoon of the weekend was ending, but carrying with her the light of a new understanding. The awareness that life could be richer when fear didn't dictate her choices, that love, like adventure, required taking the first uncertain step, and that the reward often lay beyond the walls we build around ourselves. And when Ethan parked outside her apartment, he turned to her with a quiet smile, his hand brushing against hers in a gesture that was tender, deliberate, and full of unspoken meaning, and he said, "I'm glad you came." And Sophie's heart swelled, the words simple yet resonating, echoing the truth she felt deep within, that this choice, this leap, had changed her, had awakened emotions she had long denied, had shown her that stepping into the things that frighten us most can lead to moments of profound beauty and joy. And as she stepped out of the car, her fingers lingering in his for a heartbeat longer, she realized she had discovered a new freedom, a new self, one capable of embracing life with courage, with hope, with openness, and the knowledge that fear, while always present, no longer had the power to limit her. And in the quiet of her apartment later, as she unpacked her bag and glanced out the window at the city bustling below, she reflected on how much the weekend had shifted her perspective, that the tentative steps she had taken into vulnerability and intimacy had blossomed into a deeper awareness of what it meant to be alive, to connect, to feel, to love without reservation. And she smiled, remembering the small moments, Ethan's quiet laughter, the soft touch of his hand, the way he had listened, truly listened, without judgment, the shared silences that had spoken volumes, the breathtaking landscapes they had explored together, the confessions of fear and longing that had passed between them, all combining to teach her that sometimes the things we fear most are exactly the things we need to experience to grow, and that courage isn't the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. And she realized that while the weekend was over, the change it had sparked within her was permanent, a shift in her heart and mind that would influence every choice she made moving forward, that she was no longer someone hiding behind routine, but someone willing to face uncertainty, to embrace vulnerability, to let life and love enter fully. And as the evening drew near, Sophie sat by her window, reflecting on the unexpected adventure, the risk she had taken, the fear she had confronted, and the beauty she had discovered not just in Ethan, but in herself, understanding that the most powerful experiences often come disguised as fear, and that sometimes, by stepping into what scares us most, we uncover a version of life and love more extraordinary than we could have imagined. and with a deep breath, a calm smile, and a heart brimming with hope, Sophie finally felt the truth she had only begun to sense at the start of the weekend: the most feared thing in life, when faced courageously, can become the best, most unforgettable experience, shaping us, awakening us, and leading us into a life filled with connection, joy, and the quiet, powerful knowledge that we are capable of more than we ever believed. And as she turned off the lights and rested her head on the pillow that night, the echoes of laughter, shared secrets, and tender moments lingered, a testament to the courage it takes to embrace fear, to love, and to live fully, leaving her ready for whatever came next, knowing that the act of saying yes, of daring to step into the unknown, had opened the door to a life far richer than the one she had left behind.